So now we're going to shift directions a little bit and apply this idea of deviant overconformity to eating disorders. When we think of the word deviance, usually, at least to me, what comes to my mind are things like domestic violence or attacks on sports officials and things like that. We'll actually cover attacks on players and officials more so in our violence section. But the reason I bring eating disorders to the play is it's something that's really hidden in our society to a certain degree. It's not really understood, and it's not really understood in terms of athletes. So we're going to take the rest of this lecture and look at eating disorders in athletes. So let's first look at and define two types of eating disorders. And the first one is anorexia nervosa, and typically just referred to as anorexia. And the second one is bulimia. So those with anorexia will often starve themselves. They'll have excessive weight loss. Those who have bulimia tend to binge eat and then purge. We typically think of purging by throwing up. You can also purge with an abuse of laxatives, and actually some athletes will over-exercise to the point, to try and quote-unquote burn that off. So looking back at anorexia, some symptoms of this eating disorder is the intense fear of weight gain or being fat, a refusal to eat in front of others. Some physical symptoms would be dry skin and thin scalp hair. You can also see that people who are anorexic may have poor memory and lack of judgment. They also usually engage in ritualistic eating. They'll cut their food into very small pieces. This is in part to give the illusion that they're eating because they're physically moving the food around, but if you're not paying attention, you don't notice that they're really not eating. Some symptoms of bulimia include feeling out of control during a binge, eating beyond the point of comfortable fullness. We're taught now to pay attention to our body and recognize when it's full, but people who binge eat just keep eating and eating and eating. They also have extreme concern with their body weight and their shape. With those with bulimia, we see some perhaps more physical evidence than we see with anorexia. So you may see laxatives or packaging for laxatives, diet pills, drugs that induce vomiting. Those are emetics. Diuretics reduce fluids. People who regularly go to the bathroom immediately after meals. If you're a Seinfeld fan, you remember there's an episode where George suspected that the woman he was dating was bulimic because she would eat and then immediately go to the bathroom. So he followed her into the bathroom to find out. Turns out he was sorely mistaken. It's quite a funny episode. But that can be a sign. Compulsive exercising. And then there are some physical signs, such as broken blood vessels in the eyes. This comes from vomiting over and over again. Cavities and diseased gums. Enamel erosion on your teeth, again from the throwing up. Rashes and pimples. Small cuts and calluses across the tops of your finger joints. And again, this is because you're sticking your fingers down your throat to induce vomiting. Now, I made a little joke with the Seinfeld episode, but in reality, eating disorders are very problematic. And anorexia is the third most common chronic illness among adolescents. So that's a really big deal. And again, it's not really recognized in the general population, but also less so with athletes. So only 1 in 10 men and women with eating disorders receive treatment. So again, only 1 in 10. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. So the mortality rate associated with anorexia is 12 times higher than the death rate associated with all causes of death for females 15 to 24 years old. I mean, to me, this is really staggering. The reason why is because of what it physically does to the body, what anorexia does to the body, and that's malnutrition. You're depriving your body of the nutrients it needs to function. And so, honestly, your body tissue starts to be cannibalized. The heart tissue cannibalizes itself. And so the most common occurrence then is a heart attack. So it's not necessarily that people waste away to the point of nothing. Yes, they do, but then the ultimate cause of death is typically a heart attack because the heart just can't sustain the body anymore. So when we look at eating disorders and these stats, one of the things that plays a big role is the media and the images that we're seeing. And unfortunately, we're now seeing more men becoming a victim of an eating disorder. They're seeing more pressure in the media about body types, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But I was reading an article about eating disorders, and the following stats, and you can see them on your screen, really just blew me away. It really illustrates the power of what we see in advertising. So 47% of girls in 5th through 12th grade reported wanting to lose weight because of magazine pics. So we're talking about 10 and 11-year-olds up through 18-year-olds. 69% of girls in 5th through 12th grade reported that magazine pictures influenced their idea of a perfect body shape. And 81% of 10-year-olds are afraid of being fat. Again, just blew me away. 81% of 10-year-olds are afraid of being fat. So we're definitely not doing a good job of creating healthy body images and ideals for both boys and girls. Again, these stats are just for girls. But think about this too. If this is how the general population reacts, how might athletes react? Because they technically have more at stake. They have to have more fit bodies to be successful athletes. So let's look specifically at eating disorders and athletes. And why are they more prevalent among athletes in general? The first reason are the characteristics and attitudes of elite athletes. So think about this. Elite athletes are very goal-oriented. Success at any cost. High self-expectations. Looking at the Olympics. And I'm blanking on her name, but it was, Lindsey Vonn had high expectations, but I'm thinking of the other one, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on her name, but who was more of the slalom skier, and how she was talking about, had great chances to win 5 medals at the Olympics. So again, high self-expectations, perfectionism, competitiveness, preoccupation with weight and dieting, and even a tendency towards depression. So these are all characteristics of elite athletes. These are also traits found in those with anorexia. So the two groups share very similar traits. And a study of NCAA trainers found that 91% of them believed that they had encountered an athlete with an eating disorder. So let's look at some specific sports where athletes are more susceptible to eating disorders. The first one the first category are lean sports. And these are sports with the weight class requirement. So having a lean body or low body weight gives you a competitive advantage. So gymnastics is really the prime example. Diving, rowing, ballet, running, cycling, jockeying, meaning being a horse jockey, wrestling, swimming, figure skating, dance. So, with many of these sports, there's a focus on appearance, especially with figure skating. So there's a focus on appearance and on the individual athlete rather than the team. So many of these sports, the whole aesthetics, how you look, how your body looks as it's performing is part of your performance, part of how you're perceived. Along with that are judged sports. And this is really interesting. So the prevalence of eating disorders is 13% compared to 3% in refereed sports. And again, it goes back to this idea of the aesthetics playing a role. And there's the subjectivity of the judging system. So think back, we read an article on media and framing, and we looked at descriptors used for the sport of diving. Graceful, clean, beautiful. So these are all things that are very subjective. A judge has to look at that performance and decide how to rate it. And that's very different from being the first person in track to cross a finish line. You don't need a judge for that. You need some sort of scoring system. And we do that with videos and lasers and all of that fun stuff. So let's look specifically at gymnasts and why they may be more vulnerable to eating disorders. You have a couple of links and articles to look at, and so make sure that you do review those because they tie in directly to this discussion. So when we talk about gymnastics, we actually see a lot going on. So first of all is the impact of puberty. If you go back and look at old gymnastic videos, the routines were less demanding and athletic as they are now. I mean, the flips, the spins, the floor routines, the things that these athletes can do with their bodies is really amazing. But for gymnasts and other young athletes, puberty can mess that up. Depending on how your body develops, you get changes in height, you get changes in weight distribution, your center of gravity. It can impact your body image, and it can also throw off your balance and interfere with your performance. So this is a really interesting finding that over the past 30 years, elite gymnasts have become significantly younger and smaller in terms of body size and weight. So in the 1964 Olympics, the all-around title was won by 26-year-old Vera Kozlovska. She was 5'3", 121 pounds. In the 1993 Olympics, Shannon Miller won the all-around title, 16 years old, 4'10", 79 pounds. Gabby Douglas in the 2012 Olympics was 4'11", 90 pounds, 16 years old. So again, we're seeing that there's more pressure in terms of the performance and the expectations, and that to meet that, the athletes are younger and younger, and going through puberty can mess that up. Another factor is coaching. Many coaches are very authoritarian and dictate a great portion of the athletes' lives. Coaches are seen as role models, and athletes have a strong desire to please them. So some elite athletes have started very, very young, and this is a time when they're very impressionable. So a recommendation from a coach to lose weight may be seen as a requirement for improved performance. So one study I read discussed former gymnasts, and a former gymnast said her club coach would punish team members if they exceeded their assigned weight. They were verbally abused, denied meals, and at times confined to a fat room. So we see then too that there's all of this leads to this pressure and stress, and it increases as the sport becomes more competitive. We also found another study that looked at adolescent dancers and gymnasts found that pressures to please parents and a drive for perfectionism were negative stressors for gymnasts. So you may be like, well, how does this relate to eating disorders? Well, part of it is, again, this sport emphasizes being small and compact yet powerful. And there's also very little control with these athletes' lives. Usually the control is with the parents and more often the coaches. So being forced to eat a certain way or to eat a certain amount is a lot of pressure and stress. And so athletes can turn to eating disorders to try and manage that. So a second sport, and you may not have ever thought of this one, where athletes are more susceptible to eating disorders is actually horse racing. Being a jockey is actually pretty pressure-laden. Jockeys have to make weight and stay light enough to ride. So, said one jockey, we have to be smaller, skinnier, and lighter, and stronger at the same time. So the video that you look at talks about a specific jockey and how at 5'6", he's actually 2 inches taller than the average size of jockeys, which is 5'4". Generally, making weight can be anywhere from 106 to 126 pounds. The variation is because there's no current rule that addresses what weight you have to be, as well as weight reduction methods. So each race course sets its weight. So rather than having a rule across the board saying jockeys need to be 124 pounds or less, it can differ based on the race course. And so that can make it difficult for jockeys as well. There are also no rules that address weight reduction methods. So if you are close to not making weight, you're out of a job. So jockeys will vomit. This is called flipping and heaving. Many locker rooms actually have heave bowls where people can go and throw up. They'll have a hot box where you can sweat off pounds. So there's a lot of, what do I want to say? Again, a lot of flexibility in terms of what weight you have to be at. As I said, each race course sets its own weights. The Kentucky Derby, jockeys can weigh 126 pounds. But again, most weight assignments are between 110 and 114. So again, a sport that we may not really think about a lot, but one where the jockeys have to make weight in order to be employed. So take a second and look at this quote. So the fear is that there will always be someone out there who is willing to do damage to their body for the competitive advantage, and only a culture change can alter that background acceptance of unhealthy behavior. So to me, this is pretty powerful, and it shows the relevance of social and cultural factors in promoting what is seen as healthy and ideal. So we've talked about eating disorders in general, but let's talk about men and eating disorders. Because as I said before, more and more men are experiencing eating disorders. So typically in sports that call for weight restrictions. So male wrestlers have a higher rate of eating disorders than the male population at large. They believe that they have to have less body fat in order to be successful. They feel that losing weight will improve their chances of winning. But the reality is when you deprive your body of food and fluids, it actually creates an adverse physiological effect. And it makes you weaker when you're trying to compete. So, similar to jockeys, wrestlers will cut or lose weight by throwing up, by using saunas to steam the weight off. They'll run in rubber and plastic suits to sweat off pounds as well. Now, one of the things with male athletes and just males in general is they're much less likely than females to seek help for an eating disorder. And the reason is because it's seen as a female disease. We don't have a lot in the media that addresses men with eating disorders. And that's unfortunate. I've talked to a lot of athletes and they talk about how in a women's locker room, there are posters everywhere for describing how to recognize symptoms and where to go to get help. But there's nothing like that in a man's locker room. And so we need to be a little bit more equal opportunity in terms of recognizing that men are facing increasing pressure to monitor their body image. So where is that pressure coming from? I pulled some pictures, and that's what the next couple of slides are, from popular men's magazines such as Men's Health and GQ. And all of them are emphasizing the messages that men are receiving. Most of the headlines in the covers talked about abs and talked about getting bigger biceps and dropping weight fast. So we see a shift where for men, more and more the media, and when I talk about media, I'm talking about film and print media, commercials, TV, news stories, things like that. They're emphasizing strength, athleticism, these six-pack abs, and the size and strength of musculature. So in one of the headings I saw, or in one of the covers, I saw a heading that said, gym-free abs. Well, I'm in. Just tell me where to sign up. I would love to have abs without going to the gym, right? But we see how, one, like with this men's fitness cover, it's Liam Hemsworth, who's pretty well known. So we have popular figures, but showing them, again, whether their shirt is on or off, we're seeing extreme musculature. And a lot of the headlines that I call them that females have seen for a very long time. How to do 10-minute exercises, the super fast 4-day plan to get your hardcore abs, get your abs back, how to eat better. But again, emphasizing that this is the ideal body shape for men. So again, we see that females have really traditionally experienced these pressures. Males are experiencing them now, to be muscular and fit, to be masculine. And being masculine is very important for men. It's a value that is emphasized over and over and over again. Females have a lot more freedom to be more rough and tumble, but males have very little freedom to be more feminine. They're called out for that. So looking at or wrapping up our discussion of eating disorders, again, you can function at a high level, but eventually there's a problem. So Dara Torres, who was an Olympic swimmer who has come out and talked about her eating disorder, she gave this quote, "The worst part of my bulimia was its psychological effect. Sure, I had no energy in the water and my face was bloated, but the real problem was that I lost my mind. I was extremely dark and moody. Pretty much all I thought about during college was what I ate, what I wanted to eat, what other people ate, what I need to get rid of, what I need to do to get rid of the calories I'd ingested, how much exercise I got, and how I would look in my swimsuit when I mounted the blocks." So again, this really ties into the psychological consequences of eating disorders. But there are also physical consequences. Our bodies can get injured more easily if we don't eat enough. Our bodies take longer to heal if we don't eat enough. Females also experience risk of the female athlete triad. And you may or may not have heard of this, but it's really 3 symptoms. So you have, when an athlete eats too few calories, your brain hormone levels start to change. For females, this sends disrupting signals to the ovaries to produce estrogen. So females who are not eating enough actually stop producing estrogen. Some females, if they have an eating disorder prior to puberty, they delay puberty because their body is not producing enough estrogen to start puberty. But it actually gets worse because estrogen is key to bone development. 90% of our peak bone mass for females is attained by age 18. So if you're not eating enough, not getting enough estrogen, you're not menstruating, you're not entering puberty, or you're cutting off your menstrual cycle, it actually has an effect on your bone mass. It disintegrates your bones in essence. You have very poor bone health. And so they talk about how in female athletes with eating disorders, their bone density is the equivalent of like an 80-year-old woman. So again, we can see that eating disorders have both psychological as well as physical consequences. So again, what do we do? Well, the first thing is awareness. And actually, February is Eating Disorder Awareness Month. Oftentimes, athletes are told to lose weight, but that's all they're told. They're not told how to do it and how to do it in a healthy manner. So we need to identify practical, helpful, and realistic strategies to do so. And again, we need to generate awareness of this. So as we wrap up, you can watch these last 2 clips that talk about some of these issues in terms of being aware and being realistic and having practical strategies to be an athlete who can manage his or her weight without turning to an eating disorder. And so next, we will talk about violence in sports.